Good evening. I'm Patrick Madden, and welcome to the National Archives Foundation's virtual program series. We are delighted to have you tonight for this terrific discussion on the hottest new museum in Washington, Planet Word. Thank you for joining us from home. We're happy to bring the National Archives to you. The National Archives is the nation's memory with more than 5 billion records. Through these spirited conversations, we like to open up the doors and share them with the American public. If you're a regular to our programs, welcome. If you're new, thanks for joining us today, which will be our last program for 2020. Hopefully you've been hearing about us through our emails, American Experience, or History Snacks for our young followers of history. You can find the details of our organization and these emails at archivesfoundation.org. And there's only a few days left to access the best museum online store in DC and the country. Well, we might as well just throw it out there nationally at nationalarchivestore.org for all your gift needs. If you order before 2 o'clock tomorrow, you can get your gifts before Christmas. Now, our special guest today will be taking your questions. And so before we begin, we want to make sure you know how to use the chat. We'll be using the YouTube chat function. And so right now, so you get a little practice, put your hometown and state in there. I see we've got a lot of regulars with us who are sharing where they're watching from. It's great. We'll give a shout out to you later on in the program. Well, now let me introduce our special featured guest today. Rebecca Roberts has been many things, including but not limited to a journalist, producer, tour guide, forensic anthropologist, event planner, political consultant, jazz singer, radio talk show host, and the reason you're all here, curator of programming for Planet Word. She's the author of 3 books, and she serves on a number of boards, and just joined one I'm a little familiar with. That would be the board of the National Archives Foundation. Rebecca, welcome. Are you with us?
I'm so happy to be here, Patrick. Thank you so much for having me.
It's terrific to have you. We're delighted to finish our programming year with you and this great museum. Before we get started, I have to ask. Obviously, it's been a long 2020. Yeah. How are you doing? How's your family doing and surviving everything?
We are surviving. Thank you for asking. My 2 oldest came home from the odd version of college they were attending, and so I've got a full nest again, which makes me happy.
Terrific. Well, I'm excited. So as we were planning for this, I was able to sneak into the museum when it was open for a few hours, few days, few weeks earlier in the year before things had to close down, along with the archives and the Smithsonian for obviously the health situation. So I was lucky enough to see it. And as soon as I saw it, I knew this is going to be a terrific program. So I have to ask you were at the Smithsonian. Yeah. You were lured away to this project. How did they do that? How'd you get lured away?
I have to say, I'm a local kid. I grew up going to the Smithsonian and the archives and the National Gallery and all these institutions that I totally revere. I loved working at the Smithsonian. I loved being able to do, particle physics on Monday and Civil War history on Tuesday. But when I found out about a Museum of Words and Language opening up in my own hometown and the chance to develop the entire programming and education department, and since then, because we're a startup, it's also turned out I'm in charge of the visitor services and volunteers and private events and community outreach as well. So it just was too great an opportunity to pass up. And you did get a chance to see it, but a lot of people haven't. We did open October 22nd for a month. It was great. Then made the hard call that for the safety of the community, we did need to close again for the rest of the year. So I am going to take you all on a virtual tour, assuming that most of you have not had a chance to see the real thing. But I look forward to welcoming you all to the museum once we're able to open our doors again. And I would say, if you're curious about the museum, the website's planetwordmuseum.org. That's where our programming and a video of our opening are, but it's also where you can subscribe to the newsletter and find out when we're going to open again. So we're housed in the Franklin School, which is this gorgeous, gorgeous historic DC schoolhouse. It was built in 1869. And I love that we're in a school. I love that we have the legacy of that history behind us, but it's also a really architecturally interesting place. First of all, it's perfectly symmetrical, because when it was first built in 1869 as a schoolhouse, it was the first co-ed public high school in the city, segregated, entirely white in 1869. But that was considered a little progressive, right? To have boys and girls in the same school, but they certainly weren't in the same class. So everything in the building is mirrored. So you see there are 2 front doors. Every room on the north side has a corresponding room on the south side because of the boys and girls issue. But that actually makes it a pretty interesting place for a museum. And just to give you a quick idea of where it is, that green teardrop is the museum. It's at the corner of 13th and K in downtown Washington, on the north side of the mall. So among a cluster of other arts and culture institutions like the National Museum of Women in the Arts and the Oratory Gallery and Ford's Theater. We're not far from the White House. We've got a bunch of metro stops. So it's incredibly convenient for locals and tourists as well as for those of us who work there, frankly. And it came about because of the vision of our founder, Anne Friedman. Anne Friedman spent her career playing with words in various different ways. She was a translator, she was a copy editor, and at the end of her working career was a teacher in Montgomery County Public Schools here in suburban Maryland, and taught the first grade. So she was there at that moment when kids decode language, you know, when they figure out that those symbols mean something and you can put them together in a way that can tell stories and tell jokes and tell songs. And she loved that moment of joy and wonder. And then she saw older kids kind of lose it and say, reading's not for me. And I'm not much of a book person. And so when she retired from teaching, she wanted to find some way to recapture that joy of words and language for all ages. And this is now sort of taken on the origin myth of our museum, but it happens to be true. She read an article about a hedge fund manager who had started the Museum of Math in New York. And she thought, well, you know what? If you can have a museum of math, you can certainly have a museum of words. And she just dreamed this up out of her own head, and then got the lease to the Franklin School, which had been abandoned for about 12 years. So it was needing a new makeover and some new love and some new life. So briefly, I mentioned the school opened in 1869. After it was a high school, it was a normal school, a teacher training school. That's what that image on the right is a student teacher practicing with some youngins there. And then it was for a lot of the 20th century DC public school administrative offices. And then it briefly was a homeless shelter, and then it had been empty. So Anne took over the lease on the building. The first thing that needed to happen was massive historic rehabilitation and construction work in the building before she could then install the exhibits. And as you can see from this image, those 2 front doors, which are on 13th Street, there are stairs to get to those. So that's not up to any kind of accessibility code. But it turned out we actually owned the little space between the Franklin School and the pension building next door. So we moved the entrance around the corner onto K Street, which is at grade, so we didn't need to have stairs, and built this lovely little courtyard. But then we had just hidden the entrance to our museum. So what do you do when no one can find the front door? Well, what you do is you build a big crazy sculpture in the courtyard. This is called the Speaking Willow. The artist is Raphael Lozano Hemmer. And each of those white cups is actually a speaker, and they're motion activated. So as you walk under it, each of those speakers light up and speak in a different language. This tree speaks 360 different languages, and they don't all say the same thing. Some are conversation, some are poetry. So as you wander under this tree and the voices sort of track you, first of all, it's really beautiful and cool, but it also kind of explores the diversity of the world's language from the very first second you've stepped onto our property. You're not even in the museum yet, and you're getting this experiential moment where you're hearing all of these voices. It's also really striking visually, so we hope it sort of lures people off of K Street wondering what it is. It's really quite beautiful. And then you come into the building, and we encourage you to go up to the 3rd floor and work your way down. You don't have to if you don't want to, it's non-linear, but if you go this way, there's a little bit of a pedagogical path that I'm gonna kind of take you through now. So when you get off the elevators on the 3rd floor or the stairs, the first thing you see is this video wall that has all of these YouTube videos, home videos that we have licensed that just couldn't be cuter, of babies learning how to talk. And it takes you through the process of how humans acquire language, which happens at really predictable rates. So deaf babies babble at the same rate that speaking babies babble in whatever language they're learning. Humans acquire language at very predictable signposts. regardless of what language they're speaking. So this is the only passive experience in the museum. This is the only time we ask you to sort of stand back and watch something. And it's super cute. And by the end of it, you've sort of gotten to 3 or 4-year-old kids who are learning to piece together sentences and play with words. And then this video then finally asks you, but where do those words come from? And for that, you go into our kind of showstopper gallery, which is this 40-foot wall of over 1,000 words. It's almost never lit like this, but I wanted to give you this image so that you could get a sense of its size and scale, at least in the 2D version you're looking at now. The words on the bottom, it's 3D a little bit. So the words on the bottom come out a little bit further, they're larger, and they're more common. And as the words go up and get closer to the wall, they become less common words. Now, what this actually is sort of an introductory film to the museum that talks about how words enter the English language. So it goes through all of the different civilizations that conquered England and brought their language traditions with them. It goes through onomatopoeia, portmanteau, coined words, all of these different ways that words enter English. But at any given point in the narration, it stops and asks the audience for a prompt. So those black stands at the bottom of this picture are microphones. Depending on what the audience says, the experience branches out in different ways. So not only do you learn a lot here, you're also getting to know that this museum wants you to talk to it. It's going to talk back. It's a voice-activated museum. And this is not the kind of place where you sort of stand back and admire the artwork and speak in hushed tones. It's not that kind of museum at all. It's also really visually beautiful, as you can see from a few of these images going by. And then the third gallery on the third floor is this very grand room. It's the room that was the auditorium when the building was a school. And there's this massive 5,000 LED globe in the center, surrounded by iPad stands. And on each of those iPads is the face of a language ambassador. And they're lined up geographically around the globe where they would be. So as, for instance, you walk by the Pacific Ocean, the language ambassador's face says, "I speak native Hawaiian. Would you like to learn something about Hawaiian?" And you get a linguistic lesson, again, voice-activated, participatory, where in the instance of Hawaiian, you learn there's only 16 letters in the alphabet, and you'll never see 2 consonants next to each other in Hawaiian. And because of that, the words get very long because these same sounds are repeated over and over again. And you learn to say the name of a triggerfish. The name is Hunu Hunu Nuku Nuku Apua. And if you say that, then there's a takeover on that LED globe where it lights up with fishes swimming across the globe for you. And so there are 28 spoken languages, 2 sign languages in this room. They vary geographically. They each have a sort of different interesting linguistic thing to bring. We wanted to choose the languages represented by the largest expat communities here in DC. There's some endangered languages. Piscataway is represented here, which is one of the languages spoken by the indigenous populations here in Washington. And you can do one of these and move on. You can do all 30 of them if you want to. They're pretty cool. Also, you can see on the left there, those screens on the blue wall. Every gallery has a few sort of side experiences that dive into something that's a little bit tangential to the main experience. So for instance, there's a whole side experience on endangered language in this gallery. There's a side experience on conlangs, constructed languages. And each of them have sort of a tracked question. The one for conlang says, what language do elves speak? And if that's something you want to learn about, you go, and again, interactive, voice activated, often a quiz feature. The other thing I will say about this room, which is just kind of amazing, is because it is so beautiful and historic, and you can see the historic frescoes on the walls and the proscenium there on the left, we want to be able to use it for events. But there's this giant globe in the way. Well, the giant globe retracts and becomes a chandelier, which is sort of an amazing feat of engineering. This is a still from our opening video. That's Renee Fleming performing in this room with the globe retracted. And she was singing both sides now. So we programmed the globe to have clouds on it. So there's just some nifty little things going on throughout this museum wherever you go. So that's the third floor. That gives you this kind of basis, how babies acquire language, how words enter English, how languages vary around the globe. And then everything else in the museum is just all the cool stuff you can do with words. And you can do a lot of cool stuff with words. you can make music. So this is the Karaoke Gallery where you learn about songwriting techniques, and it's absolutely a karaoke experience. This is shot looking at the singers, but if you shot it the other way, the screen they're looking at looks like a karaoke room. The lyrics are scrolling by, but on the sides of the screen are songwriting lessons. So Beyonce is making use of assonance here. Drake is using slant rhyme. This is forced rhyme from Mary J. Blige, whatever it is. You know, Paul Simon using echo. And so we've licensed a bunch of songs from a bunch of different genres, bunch of different historic periods. You can find the one that lights your fire. Although I have to say, in the month we were open, I never, ever, ever want to hear Let It Go ever again. It is by far the most commonly chosen tune in the karaoke room. You can tell jokes with words. This is the humor gallery. There's an experience here where you try to make each other laugh with these, I must say, incredibly corny jokes. But even corny jokes can be fun sometimes. And then there's also an analog experience here where you pose with some props of visual idioms like serial killer and things like that. Then there's this funny little gallery, and I love this room because this is such a creative choice on the part of our exhibit designers, which is a firm out of New York called Local Projects. This is this little windowless room, and it was sort of hard to know what to do with it in terms of museum traffic. So what's here is a mural that's projected on 3 walls, a city, and then it sort of goes to a pasture with a lake, and then the third wall over to the left has a house and a bridge and a mountain. And you take one of these fiber optic paintbrushes and you dip it in an adjective like nocturnal or crepuscular. And whatever adjective you dipped in, you can then paint the wall and the setting will change based on the word you chose. This is very hard to describe. I do have a little video of my colleague, Emily. She's on the left wall. She is choosing autumnal. And I am going to show you what happens when she dips her brush in autumnal. And then you see the leaves on the tree turn color, the sky gets a little orange, the bird takes on autumnal plumage, and she paints it on through. And one of the amazing things I've discovered as I've watched visitors in the museum is there are some Easter eggs in doubles. So if you paint with tempestuous, it always rains. If you paint with hibernal, it always becomes wintry. In the places where tempestuous and hibernal overlap, you get snow. If you paint with nocturnal, of course, it becomes nighttime and the bird becomes an owl and the moon comes out. But if you paint with nocturnal and hibernal in one place, you get the northern lights. So it's really, it teaches you about setting, and obviously more than one person can do it at a time. So you see people finding these funny overlaps. That weird dragon on the left is somebody painting with surreal. When the airplane that loops through the mural hits surreal, it becomes a dragon. When it loops through nostalgic, it becomes a blimp. We've also found little kids really like this room because you don't even really need to read, but you do get a sense of how words can really change the tone of a story. And speaking of stories, the next gallery here is the Magical Library. Every word museum needs a library. We get asked all the time, like, what even is a word museum? Do you have artifacts? Like, what are we going to be looking at? And we try to make the point that it's not just about books. We're not a library. We're not a bookstore, but you can't not, explore the written word when you're a word museum. But our library has a few different experiences. In fact, all of those books at that center console table that are facing out towards you, in fact, all the books all around the walls that are facing out towards you as well, you can pick them up and you open them onto a cradle space in that central table. And animation plays projected onto the book. And because these books are a huge range of poetry, prose, fiction, nonfiction, contemporary books, historic books, children's books, there's even a cookbook in there. The animations are all very different. This is Life of Pi. But for something like Snowy Day, which is a picture book, it might really kind of tell the story, the projection. For something that's a little bit denser, like To Kill a Mockingbird, it's narrated by a lawyer who was inspired by that book as a kid. But each of them are really beautiful and they bring the book to life in a way that makes you want to read it. Another experience in the library are these dioramas. All around the bookcases are mirrors in gilt frames that have a phrase engraved at the bottom. And if you come right on up to the frame and you say that phrase out loud, the backlight comes on in the mirror and you see this diorama and a voiceover finishes the phrase from the book. This is the Phantom Toll Booth. This has been fun too, to watch visitors realize you actually have to talk to the museum, right? So especially in the library, we're also trained to be hushed and polite, and you got to walk up to the wall and start talking. It takes a leap for some people. Kids and teenagers do it immediately. They want to figure out how it works. They poke at it, they talk to it, they want it. You see some of the older museum goers really hesitant to break out of that mold, but that's one of the things we wanted to create, was that sense of surprise and delight and discovery throughout the museum. The third experience in the library, I will not spoil for you because I want you to find it on your own, but I will tell you that one of these bookcases is a door, and that door leads you to a secret poetry nook. The final gallery on the second floor is an oratory gallery. Speech making is something you can do with words, especially here in this town. So similar to the karaoke experience, you learn about a few famous speeches, and then you can deliver one yourself. There's a teleprompter and you can make a recording of yourself delivering a speech. We don't have as many speeches as we have songs, but again, we were going for diversity. So there is Oprah's Academy Awards speech. There's Malala speaking to the UN. There's JFK, ask not what your country can do for you. There's Queen Elizabeth I. There's Remember the Titans. I will tell you, from the month we were open, by far the most popular choice, Mufasa from The Lion King, giving the Circle of Life speech. That seems to be the big winner in the Oratory Gallery. So that is the second floor. And then there are two galleries on the ground floor, each of which sort of explore why words are important, right? Why does this all matter? Yes, words are joyous and words are beautiful and words are full of wonder, but words are also really important. So this is the Media and Persuasion Gallery. In this media spiral, you learn some copywriting techniques. You learn how to use words to change people's minds. You learn to take a little bit of a critical eye on how people are trying to change your mind to get you to buy a product or support a cause. And throughout this media spiral, there are little interactives where you see real ads and learn a little bit about the wordplay involved in them. And then at the center of the spiral, there are some maker stations where you take what you learned and make your own ad. And then your ad is added to this media spiral. So a piece of your creativity is left behind in the museum as you go. And then the final gallery we call Words Matter. This has some life-size video plinths with people telling first-person stories about how words change their lives. So there is a gentleman who uses a wheelchair talking about how he's always hated the word handicapped. There's somebody talking about code switching between Latina and Jewish. There's somebody talking about pronouns. There's a very beloved soccer coach here in Washington talking about nicknames. And then there is an analog experience in this gallery that I have to say I was a little dubious about at first, because I wasn't sure after all of this technology and all this sort of whiz-bang voice activation and immersion and interactivity that people would be into this, but people are totally into it and I love it. These are paper circles that each have a prompt on them, like one word I love from another language is, one word people use to describe me is, one word I wish people were more careful with is, and you just write your answer and then hang it on the wall. And by the end of a weekend, these walls are covered in colored circles with really thoughtful and clever and funny and interesting answers to these prompts. That wall that this actor is hanging her circle on in this picture is a recording booth. So in the center of this room, there is a recording booth where you can then tell your own word story. We have prompts in there as well, but if you are moved to talk about the role words have played in your life, a word that is particularly special to you, that you have that opportunity here. And so those are the galleries. We do have one gallery that is not ready yet, so the entire museum is free admission. That's really important to us. We will have one gallery that is ticketed, and it is coming next spring, and it's a puzzle room. It's very different in feel and look from everything else I've just showed you. It's being designed by a group out of Seattle called Lone Shark Games, L-O-N-E, Lone. And a lot of what they do is escape rooms. But this exhibit will be designed, like set designed, almost like a little quaint village. And you rent cases, and the cases are very visually appealing. One looks like a violin case, one looks like a hat box, one looks like an astronaut's helmet. And you open them up and there's a whole series of nested word puzzles in the case that you have to go around the room to solve. But the ticket price is for the case, not by the human. So you can do them in groups, and we can roll out new cases to keep the puzzling world interested, because we know they are very fond of this museum already, and we definitely want our puzzle friends to stay with us. So that is something that will be coming May-ish, June-ish. We're looking forward to it. It's going to be called Lexicon Lane. And then the other thing I would say is, these exhibits are spectacular, and I can't wait for you all to experience them. They are permanent. We might be able to update some of the books and songs and speeches, but they're not going anywhere. So that then means, for me as curator of programming, that if we want to stay relevant and dynamic and on top of current events, we also need to have a whole stream of things going on in the museum. Certainly novel writing workshops and poetry slams and calligraphy classes and all of that. And I don't need to create that stuff myself. Washington's actually a really creative place. All those things are happening. I just need to partner with the people who are doing them and give them the space to do it in a post-COVID world when we're able to welcome people into the museum. But also lecture series and book talks and workshops, and after hours parties and all the things that keep a museum really vital and interesting, as everyone at the Archives Foundation knows. No matter how spectacular your exhibits are, people only come twice if you keep things really interesting. So that is the basic story of Planet Word. I've sort of ripped you through a virtual tour. I would say if you do want more information, the website's planetwordmuseum.org. And again, just to plug the newsletter, just because that's where we announce our programming. It's also where we're going to announce our reopening plans as soon as we have them. So I'm going to stop sharing here and go back to Patrick.
Yes, well, and this is a good segue to one question I saw pop up if you were going to talk about how to join or donate. Obviously, you talked about the email on the website. It's a free museum. So
yeah, which means membership's really important to us. So if people want to support the museum, thank you. That's spectacular. We do have a membership program, and that is one of the ways we're going to be able to keep this place free.
Terrific. Well, we do have some questions piling up. Before we get to that, we've got a great audience here. We have, I'm just going to try and race through this. Folks from Iowa, Massachusetts, Missouri, Alaska, California, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, my friends in White Bear Lake, they've been with us for so many programs, Minnesota, let's see, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Utah, Maui, Hawaii,
wow.
Seattle, Key West. Gosh, we've got like literally all corners of the United States here. Virginia, Maryland, DC, Tennessee, let's see if Georgia, New York, Michigan, and then we've got some international folks as well, which is great. Brazil, Belgium, Canada, El Salvador. So welcome to everybody. Not totally always our usual crowd, although I see some familiar names in the chat box. So we are going to be taking questions. We've pulled some of the ones that have come through, but if you have questions, by all means, put it in the chat box and we'll try and make our way through there. Before we get to that, I do have a couple questions. Like you sort of alluded to this. So it's a young museum, opened up for a month, and it opened in a very obviously unusual time. So how many staff are there? Usually museums have staff and docents and volunteers and all of this infrastructure.
Yeah,
obviously,
we don't have any of the things.
You were just starting to scale up on that, and we have to deal with all this healthcare stuff. So what do you anticipate when we get back to the sort of normal times? What do you have now? And just to give folks a sense of how bootstrapped you guys are.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a startup world for sure, which is incredibly exciting and also a lot of work. We had originally thought we would open in May. And we were planning for 3 days of massive celebrations and, 1,000-person family festival and big press hits. And we were just starting to think about staffing up. And we got lucky in the sense that we really hadn't added staff, so we didn't have to lay anybody off. We did, but then that meant that all summer, all the stuff that, we were planning for, we were doing with, I think there were 9 of us on staff at that point.
Wow.
And so then when we made the decision to open in October, we were only releasing 35 tickets an hour, which was fewer than the city would have let us given on the size of the facility. And like all free tickets, we noticed a pretty sizable no-show rate. So we started offering walk-ups as well. And we didn't know how many people would need to staff the museum. We didn't know if we'd need somebody in every gallery explaining what was going on. We didn't, and we didn't have those people anyway. So we were all doing everything. I mean, you could have found me at the cash register at the gift shop plenty of days. But I think that's wonderful because it means that everybody on staff, and now we're up to 13 of us. We have a full 13 people on staff. We all not only learned how to do everything, but we got to watch people interact with the museum. And I think that's really, really valuable. People like me who work in programming and education see that all the time, but it's great to have your, external relations and development and tech people all working frontline as well, because they really see how the facility is being used.
Absolutely. Well, and folks in the museum will talk about a soft launch, and you have a lot of technology, so I'm sure there's lots of testing. But until it's in the space and you just let the average visitor show up, you don't really know what they're going to do to it, how they end up breaking
there are
things.
advantages to
so
not
forth.
opening with 1,000 visitors, for sure. We definitely got to test some of the bugs in the tech. We got to figure out what path people were taking, how long they were taking in certain galleries. And of course, we were enforcing social distancing. And we, you saw a lot of touch screens in there. We gave everyone a stylus. So we're not all, touching the same stuff. We didn't know how that was going to work. There were a lot of beta groups coming through who didn't necessarily know they were guinea pigs, but people were so patient and understanding and wonderful. I think the people who wanted to come to a museum during a pandemic, wanted to come to a new museum, really understood that they were going to be helping us out, and were incredibly thoughtful about giving us feedback, helping us if something didn't go exactly the way we anticipated.
Sure. And on the technology front, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. So in the museum field, there's many museums are sitting and looking at their exhibits going, how will we reopen when, especially like a children's museum, they are encouraged to touch everything, and will people do that and so forth. But my sense is I think you touched on this a little bit, is that the cons from the beginning, there was going to be this voice activation, this sort of engagement thing, which of course lends itself to the world we're living in now with COVID and probably post-COVID with interactives in museums. So can you just talk a little bit more about the team's thinking about that as the exhibit designers were working on it?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's the 21st century museum model in general, that every exhibit is not an artifact behind glass and words on a wall explaining it. But also when you don't even have artifacts to try to present that way, we wanted people to be using words constantly. And so the voice activation is interesting because it has to learn. I mean, any of you who have gotten frustrated with your Siri or your Alexa know that sometimes you have to say something a couple of times and it gets better. But we were all trying to test things and put in different accents and put in different homonyms for things so that it recognized the broadest possible number of prompts. But we needed people in the museum to help train it. We need people with different accents. We need people with different pitches of voices. We need young people. We need old people. And voice recognition software is also very English language based. So there are sounds that it's not great at. One of the languages in that global gallery is Zulu, which is a click language. Voice recognition's terrible at click languages. So we've had to sort of learn the stumbling blocks of the technology, and we've also gotten to watch it get better, which is great. But yes, the voice, and a mask doesn't help. So on those dioramas in the library, for instance, you got to get right up on next to them and don't be shy. You have to speak right on out loud with your outside voice if you're going to talk to it wearing a mask. But I also think, and you and I have talked about this before, The museum community here in Washington is really collaborative. I think we all understand that more museums means more museum goers. We're not competing with each other. We're competing with, Netflix. And so we've all been talking all summer about how to make exhibits accessible, how to enforce rules, what do you do if someone won't wear a mask, all of the things people anticipate. So that stylus idea, I completely stole from the folks at the Spy Museum, because they have so many touch screens there, and they had developed that idea, and they'd found a good vendor, and they'd found that people were using it. And we're just all figuring it out from each other as we go.
Absolutely. And there'll be, I think, a lot more experimenting when we get around the corner here to next year and we actually get the chance to reopen and see different kinds of experiences. A lot of the same material here in Washington, but the museums will be taking a very interesting and new approach to some of it. So you're definitely ahead of the curve on that. So we've got a lot of questions starting to pile up. One question I wanted to ask is about this museum. So obviously, new museum in Washington, D.C. Are there other museums like this in the United States or around the world that you said, yeah, we want one of those in Washington? Or like, talk to me a little bit about that.
There are museums that cover some of what we cover. So there's the American Writers Museum in Chicago. There's a museum in Paris called Mundalingua, which it has live translation of its exhibits. And there are museums that explore certain aspects of language. And in fact, that's another thing we thought about being here in Washington with such a robust museum community, was that there was no reason for us to do something another museum was already doing well. So while we do have a little bit about endangered languages, the Smithsonian is the world's leading expert research branch on endangered languages. There's no reason for us to replicate that. We can just collaborate with them. Same with cryptography, which you might think would be an interesting way to explore the use of words. The Spy Museum does cryptography very, very well. And the opposite is also true. We, in fact, originally stayed away from news literacy because the museum did it so well. The idea of being a literate news consumer and bringing a critical eye to sourcing and propaganda. But then the museum closed. And we felt that that was a content area left uncovered here in town. And so we are developing with the News Literacy Project a news literacy experience in the museum, in that Media and Persuasion Gallery. So there are little bits of things covered in other museums, and certainly languages other than English. I need to emphasize this is an English language museum. And so if you want to learn a huge amount about the etymology and linguistics of Romanian, this is not the place for you. And there are museums in other places that do that on their own, but this sort of words as your collection in this immersive voice activated way. No, we're the only ones.
Okay, well, let's jump in. You actually gave me a great segue to a question here. Do you have an area in the museum for or about playwrights and their use of language and dialogue?
So I actually love this question because it teased me up to say something. So there is, you might have noticed, there is no playwriting experience in this museum. We don't actually really talk about drama at all, except in the sense that we talk about how many words Shakespeare coined. In the speech making gallery, the Elizabeth I speech is probably more dramatic than historical, but we do not take on playwriting and drama as one of the wonderful things you can do with words. And so this is exactly the kind of thing programming can do, right? So we have here in Washington a group called the Young Playwrights Theater. They are totally mission aligned with us. They do incredibly good work involving young people in creating drama, learning the structure of playwriting, and producing their shows. And again, when it's a thing again, we really look forward to being one of their homes. We have a beautiful auditorium, having some pop-up playwriting experiences in the galleries. But those are exactly the kind of things that we need to add on to the core experience.
Okay. And then sort of related to this, there is, you talked about different kind of programming you're sort of thinking about. Obviously, when we get over the hump here, there's a question about rotating exhibits. So you said most of the gallery is permanent, but there might be some changing. So just to bring another question in, because they're sort of all related, will you be sort of digitizing, or I guess animating more books in the library, like along the way. So that would draw people back, like, oh, I might find new opportunities. So just sort of about how the museum, you anticipate it being organic and changing potentially over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have now, we're going to have for a while. We worked really hard to get it here, but I do think we will add on books in the library as a good example, songs in the karaoke room, speeches in the oratory gallery, just to have some more options for people. But that's a few years down the road. We will not have a traditional, temporary exhibit space in the way other museums do. I will say that even though the experiences are permanent, because of the voice activation, you can actually have a very different experience yourself, depending on what you say to the exhibit. So it branches out in a very different way. So in that stunning word wall experience at the beginning, if you're talking about words borrowed from another language and somebody says cappuccino, you learn one whole thing, but if someone says burrito, you learn another whole thing, and you wouldn't get both of those at the same time. So because everything has kind of a story branch depending on voice prompts live in the room, you can have quite a different experience different times you come.
Okay. And given that we're in this environment right now and the museum closed, obviously because of the pandemic, what are you all doing online right now? And of course, a follow-up question is, do you have material and events and so forth for teachers and students yet, or parents and students, since there's a lot of e-learning going on?
Yeah, actually, we have a pretty robust resource for educators on our website. We, at the very beginning, worked with some consultants to go through each of the galleries and peg them to Common Core standards and grade level experiences, and develop some lesson plans around each of them. Of course, initially they were designed to wrap around a visit to the museum, but one of the things our education manager has been doing this summer, Caitlin Miller, and I am happy to say it's not me, because she's really good at it, is developing some virtual field trips because so many students are learning from home. So for instance, there's a lower grades field trip designed around that humor gallery that talks about idiomatic language and visual puns. There's an older grades one around that media and persuasion gallery that talks about copywriting techniques. And I think she did like 40 of them this month alone. She's just churning out virtual field trips because the demand is so high. And so that's obviously something that we didn't anticipate developing, but we're not going to stop even once the museum's open. If we're able to extend our reach by having virtual offerings in addition to in-person field trips, we're just going to keep doing those and doing those well. But I encourage you, if you are looking for lesson plans, virtual field trips, asynchronous experiences, on the website, there's a For Educators tab that's just got a whole lot of stuff under it.
Terrific. So I don't know, this is not my forte, but beyond sign language, is there more around synthesized speech in the museum, or how do you address that?
So there are sort of two questions there. There is the accessibility question for people who have hearing loss or are deaf, right? It's a voice activated museum. Everything's captioned. So that's something we took very seriously from the beginning, and Gallaudet University here in town helped us with that. In terms of like a speech to text or text to speech, we actually chose to use voiceover artists for almost everything. We really do want everything to sound like a person talking to you rather than a machine voice talking to you. In the few places we use a machine voice, it's intentional. So for instance, one of the side experiences in that humor gallery is, can you teach a robot to tell a joke? The answer is kinda. But in that, instead of having a human do the voiceover, we did use a synthesized voice. But we try, there's a little bit of a barrier, I think, when you're listening to a machine voice. You remember that it's not human. And also, human voices are so various and wonderful that we really wanted to explore that diversity of words and language too. This is, and I should have made this point earlier because it's really key to the museum. We are a descriptive language museum, not a prescriptive language museum. We are not going to tell you there is one standard way to speak. There is no such thing as standard English. If you were taught there was standard English, you were taught that by somebody who was educated at a certain number of schools on the East Coast, and they were probably white and they were probably male, and they were probably educated in a narrow time frame. English is evolving all the time. That's what's so cool about it. We don't have a central academy keeping English static and formal. You can change English. I can change English. The greatest innovators for 500 years in the English language have been teenage girls. They're the ones who changed doth to do and have to has. It's an amazing power that we all have to be creative with this language. So if you think that we're gonna like reinforce your stickler about it kills me that people don't use adverbs correctly, or I really wish people knew how to use semicolons, this is not the museum for you. We are not gonna back you up on your pet peeves, because part of the joy and wonder, and museums are about joy and wonder, we're not school, is that innovation in language is a good thing. That's what makes English such a fascinating, crazy, beautiful language to use.
Well, I will say that was one of the factoids I learned in that opening gallery about teenage girls. Yes, and my teenage daughter, it makes a lot more sense now. So, but that's a conversation for another time. So linguists, we have a question about, so how many linguists did you all work with, especially around the endangered languages area? Just could you talk a little bit about that development of the museum?
We have a massive advisory board. We have, the board, the nonprofit management board, but then there's this huge advisory board, because each of these experiences, while we're not prescriptive on language, we want to make sure we're presenting correct information, peer-reviewed, thoughtful, and where there's a controversy or a discrepancy in the research, we wanted to present that. So every step of the way, there's at least one linguist behind each of these experiences, from every little thing. I mean, I've told you about the galleries, but there's content all over this museum. From the moment you walk in, the terrazzo floor in the lobby has the evolution of alphabets embedded in the terrazzo. So it starts with cave drawings and hieroglyphs and spreads out to alphabets all over the world. But that required us calling up, like the world's leading expert in Mayan glyphs and saying, hey, are we getting this right in our terrazzo floor? And what should we put in the floor tiles? That guy's happy to take that call. He's not that busy. And the lockers have the International Phonetic Alphabet on them. So there have just at every step of the way been experts underpinning the content, telling us where the research is, telling us where the research might change so that we can keep an eye on that. And that's actually been one of the fun things while we're closed. For adult programming, I've been doing talks like this one, right? And I've also been interviewing some guests, and I've been able to tap into some of the linguists on our advisory board. So today, I talked about the history of crossword puzzles with Adrian Raffel. Last week I talked about choosing the word of the year with Ben Zimmer. So a lot of, big name linguists who are involved in the popularization of linguistics are involved in the museum and really happy to help us popularize their world.
Terrific. Did you mention whether there is a part of the exhibit that deals with regional dialects in the United States?
So there is one of those side experiences that talks about dialects. I think the attract prompt on that is, do you have an accent? Which of course the answer is everybody has an accent. But people love that stuff. Do you say hoagie or sub or grinder or po' boy if you're my people? And those can be very fun to kind of go through different American dialectical differences. And it shows you what a huge country this is. And it also reinforces for us this whole there is no standard English thing. And so, yes, there is an experience where you can do that. There's also this is about multilingualism, but there's this huge screen where you can input how many languages you speak or sign. And then it turns it into this massive data visualization, which is really beautiful. and you can see how many languages are represented at any given moment by the humans in the museum right that second, the humans who have visited the museum that month, and those who have visited since the doors have been open. And so you start seeing all of these different languages represented. And we know Washington's an international town, but to see it in this data visualization really reinforces, we are obviously covering a tiny fraction of the 6,000 spoken languages around the world, but to see how many people come into the museum with all these different language traditions themselves is really cool.
Wonderful. Can you talk a little bit? We've had a couple sort of varying questions about, you mentioned the museum's free. We didn't really talk about, you're in a historic building. So where did the funding come to make this happen? And your funding going forward is membership and donations, obviously a special event in the space when that's possible. Just give people a sense of the museum's operations.
No, it's a completely valid question. So the rehab of the building, which was a huge undertaking, and the city only gave Anne Friedman, our founder, the lease on the building, which is a nominal lease, if she could pay for the rehab. So Anne Friedman personally funded the rehab of the building.
Wow.
She raised the money for the design and install of the exhibits. And so we, as a brand new museum, have the incredible luxury of starting with no debt and no lease, which who gets to do that, right? So we do need to pay for our operations every year, but we have a few revenue streams for that. Yes, memberships, foundations, individual grants. We have beautiful event space. If you can see that in my Zoom before me, that top level up under the mansard roof is a gorgeous event rental space. When parties are a thing again, that's going to be a revenue stream. The gift shop, the restaurant, which is not open yet. We'll have some ticketed events. And so we will, build a funding stream going forward that will keep us solid and secure and free admission. And I think every arts institution sort of blew up their budget this year, but we are in better shape than most because of Anne's generosity and fundraising prowess. So we didn't start in the red.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and definitely an unusual model in this day and age. So it's very fortunate and hopefully inspiring for folks to come out and see. Now, you didn't mention this. We're getting to the end of our time, and I did want to share during my time. I got a little
the
photo op here. Insouciant, relaxed, casual, and unconcerned. So I thought that captured my day.
The photo booth is sponsored by the College Board. So you pose in the photo booth with basically an SAT word. You are given a multisyllabic adjective and you are meant to act it out. And the photo booth is incredibly popular. Yes, insouciant is one of the words. Mischievous, I think, is one. Grandiose. And it's so great to watch the photos click out the tray with people really getting into it. My actually favorite moment the other day before we closed, somebody had brought in a seeing eye dog, and I looked over at the photo booth and saw a little golden retriever tail wagging out the curtain. Dog had participated in the photo booth too.
Terrific.
Well, I don't know what adjective he got either.
Right. Exactly. I'm excited to see how the museum sort of grows and blossoms here over the next, when we get to the point where we're all reopening, sort of seeing our normal crowds and all of that, because I know during my experience, even though you were limiting the numbers, so there were lots of space to move around and allowed me to explore lots of languages in that upstairs, the world languages room, how people really just interact with it and enjoy it. And I think it's a terrific addition to the cultural scene in Washington. You all and the team and Anne's vision for it really comes to life. And as you go through it, there's really not a sit and kind of humdrum moment. In some of the older museums, you go, here's like you say, another thing and another case with another dead whatever. and this is, it is alive, and the technology does that, but also the sort of creative thinking about it. So bravo to you and the team. And in the words of one of our guests who shared this in the chat, she's at a loss for words. It sounds so terrific. So, and as you can imagine, right? there's been a lot of pun play in the
oh, good. I
chat.
certainly hope so.
So, Rebecca, well, this has been a great way to close out our virtual programs for this year. We want to thank you and all of the visitors who are with us. We hope that this talk has inspired them to come visit your website in the meantime, and of course, eventually make their way to Washington, or if they live here downtown when we get back to normal life, and visit the new best thing in Washington. And after they're done there, they can walk a few blocks down to the archives and revisit some of our old documents that we have around here. That's a lot of interesting words.
The founding words of the nation. That's why we wanted to be in Washington.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I have a few closing announcements. Again, as always, we want to thank all of our donors, our corporate counsel who support us, and our membership. If you are not a member of the foundation, you can join us by visiting our website, archivesfoundation.org. And then one last reminder, TikTok, if you haven't made those holiday purchases yet, you're really pressing your luck. But if you visit nationalarchivestore.org and order by tomorrow, you'll be able to get those gifts before the holiday. And as you know, this is the best gift shop in Washington. Well, that's a wrap for 2020 for us. I think we've all been waiting for 2020 to be wrapped up, but for our programming, we're done for the year. We'll be back with you in January for some terrific events. Keep up with our programs on social media and, of course, our website and emails. I also, before we close out, want to thank my staff. We've had a lot of transition this year, as you can imagine, going from a vibrant, active museum and the National Archives in the spring when all the school groups were ready to roll in, to going virtual. So thanks to the staff and all of your support, flexibility, and adaptability to make these virtual programs happening. So remember, what's past is prologue, and on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, thank you for joining us.